media, especially those who've traveled from far to be here with us this morning. We appreciate the effort. It is time once again for the annual news conference given by the President of the Caribbean Development Bank, where we will take a look at the year that has passed and make some projections for the year that we're in right now. This morning, we're going to have a simple format. We're going to have two presentations, one from the President and another from the Director of Economics, following which we will entertain questions from the media. We have a high-powered panel here this morning, and I assure you they can answer any question you can come up with. But first of all, we start with the presentation from the President of the Caribbean Development Bank, Dr. Warren Smith.
Good morning. Ooh. Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A special and very warm welcome to the ladies and gentlemen of the Caribbean media. Let me say how very pleased I am to see the broad cross-section of representation from across the Caribbean. I want to extend a very special welcome to STVS from Surinam. As you know, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm going to be speaking about it a little later on, Surinam is the latest member of the Caribbean Development Bank. So we'd like to say, Surinam, very, very happy to see you here for your first press conference. Ladies and gentlemen, each year we look forward to the opportunity to be able to exchange with you, the members of the Caribbean media, our reflections, our experiences over the past year, and to also discuss with you our expectations of what 2014 portends for us. This morning, we're going to have a very, very simple format. We have decided to make a change in the way in which we present this press conference, to allocate much longer time to you, the media. So what we have decided to do is to have two short presentations, one by myself, which is more internally focused, looking at CDB's operations, the internal challenges which we have been faced with, and how we have set about addressing them. The second part of the presentation is on the economics of the region. We're going to have our Director of Economics, Dr. Justin Ram, examine the performance of our countries. Because as you would well appreciate, as goes our countries, so goes CDB. So that we have a very, very strong self-interest in how those economies perform. Not only because it sustains us as a bank and a financial institution, but because it also is core to our mandate, which is the development of our region. For us, 2013 was a year of challenges and achievements. We have been heartened by emerging evidence in 2013 of a very strong commitment on the part of our borrowing member countries to address in a decisive manner the issues that have faced them for a number of years. I speak here specifically of the issues of fiscal and debt consolidation. Without fiscal stability, without a manageable debt, it is impossible for our countries to be able to build the type of economy which will allow our people to be able to enjoy the standard of living to which they have aspired prior to and since independence. So that there is a very, very strong need for us to ensure that that platform of stability is in place. We have also been heartened during 2013 to note that there has been evidence of incipient economic growth in most of our borrowing member countries. The adjustment process in our countries is at different stages, as you would appreciate. Some are more advanced than others. And as a consequence, the opportunity to grow is more evident in some of our countries than in others. But we must begin somewhere. And as you will hear from our Director of Economics, there is certainty now that we are beginning to emerge from the long recession, and we are beginning to show evidence that our economies are recovering. But economic recovery going forward cannot be on the same basis. If we are going to put our people in a position where they're going to be able to enjoy the standard of living to which they aspire, we have got to create a new Caribbean economy. More on that anon. I want to talk a little bit about some of the issues which we have had to deal with internally. As you would appreciate, and as you would see looking at our head table, and as you pan around the room, you will notice that we have a number of new faces. Now, at the same time that we appreciate the work, the hard work that has been carried out by the stalwarts of this institution over many years, we recognize that every institution must go through a period of renewal. That process at CDB is well underway. You see evidence of it not only at the lower ranks, where we are putting in place a new generation of highly trained professionals, but also at the leadership level, we have fresh new blood, colleagues who are coming from disparate backgrounds, but helping us to enrich this organization and to position us for the challenges that lie ahead. It is not easy to make change. Change does not happen overnight. We develop comfort levels with those with whom we have worked for many years. But it is important that we reach out to and embrace those colleagues who have joined us in recent times, who will help us to create that new organization which this region so badly needs. At the same time that we are integrating new staff and new leadership, it is important that CDB also address those challenges which have been identified over the years and more so in recent times by consultants, both internal and external. We have undergone a very, very rigid and rigorous examination by the international rating agencies. I speak here specifically of Moody's and Standard & Poor's. Both these organizations are critical to the viability and the reputation of the Caribbean Development Bank. These organizations, like the Caribbean Development Bank, have themselves experienced difficult challenges since the period 2008 till now. They have had to change the way in which they work. They have changed the manner in which they rate institutions like ourselves. And that has had an impact on the CDB. But ladies and gentlemen of the media, we at the Caribbean Development Bank, we are not afraid of criticism. We appreciate positive and constructive advice on how we can improve our organization. We got some very, very important advice from our rating agencies. And I am pleased to tell you this morning that we have taken it on board. We have acted decisively, and we have made change that has resulted in recognition from those very rating agencies of the strides that we have made. I would like to make specific reference to one of the reforms that were highlighted by the rating agencies, which is the need for an organization like ours to strengthen our risk management. That process is underway. Our staff have embraced what I've referred to elsewhere as the arcane principles of risk management. We have engaged a very experienced head of our risk management unit who has taken on board the awesome task of changing this organization to one where risk management is integrated and mainstreamed across every aspect of our work. Our staff are an integral part of that process, And as I say, I have been heartened by the manner and the alacrity with which they have gone about absorbing these new principles. We are a strong organization for it, and we are very, very appreciative of the efforts that have been made by all. This morning, as I indicated, we're going to have it's effectively a three-part presentation. The one that I am now engaged in, which looks at CDB's performance, and then Dr. Ram is going to deal with parts B and C, where he looks at developments in 2013 and 2014 on the economic front. And then he's going to, under the broad rubric of strengthening fiscal consolidation and sustaining growth, talk a little bit about some of the things that our countries need to do differently. I'm going to start my presentation or the examination of our operational performance by looking at the two principal forms of financing which CDB engages in, what we refer to as lending and the provision of grants. Oops. 2012 was not a stellar performance for CDB on the operational side. We were adversely affected by the external environment. We were also affected by the challenges that we were facing in relation to adjusting to the new rating environment. So that we set ourselves the bold charge of turning around CDB's operations in 2013. I think that if you look at this graph, look at the towers, I think you can agree with me that 2013 represented for us operationally a turnaround year. Let us dissect the slide a little bit. Let us start, first of all, with overall approvals. The overall approvals numbers might give the lie to the statement that we have had a turnaround year, because you'll notice that approvals in 2012 actually exceeded approvals in 2013. But there is an explanation. If you look to the far left of the graph under the pillars entitled grants, you'll notice that in 2012 we had $62 million worth of grants. Just a brief explanation here. We have what we refer to as our flagship poverty reduction program, Basic Needs Trust Fund. The practice is that what we do is we commit all of the resources for that 4-year cycle of that program upfront. So $57 million of those for that program, those were approved in 2012. Hence, the tall pillar that you see there representing grants in 2012. So that tends to distort the overall picture. What happened in 2013 is that we started to launch the program associated with our Basic Needs Trust Fund. Let us examine the loans picture. What you will notice, ladies and gentlemen, is that in 2013, CDB's loans performance improved by 34%. In other words, we were able to approve 139 million United States dollars in 2013 compared with 104 million in 2012. Now that's an important improvement because it is our lending operations which allows us to have a very important impact in our borrowing member countries. What you will also notice is that on the other side of the graph, to the right-hand side, is what we refer to as disbursements. Now, disbursements are when the loans actually hit the countries themselves. That is when the activity starts to take place. That's when we deliver the funding to the countries. It is also important from CDB's point of view because we don't book these loans, until they're disbursed. So when we approve $166 million, those loans and grants do not appear on CDB's books until they have actually been disbursed to the countries. So that's when you see our portfolio start to grow, is when we have disbursed the funds. Now, you will notice that in 2013, we were able to disburse $186 million, or 60% more than we dispersed in 2012. That is where the rubber really hits the road, when those funds get into our countries. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say that we are extremely pleased about the turnaround, and I would like to take the opportunity to thank our staff in operations. I would like to thank the staff on the other side of the bank, what we call the supporting side of the bank, our staff in finance, our staff in several other areas of the bank. Let me not forget legal, who plays such a pivotal role in ensuring that those terms and conditions are adequately and sufficiently in order. Thank you, colleagues. What I'd like to do now is to shift to who were the beneficiaries of these loans. Which are the countries that receive these funds from the Caribbean Development Bank? And whilst I'm at it, I would also like to speak about where the money actually went. In other words, for what purpose were these funds approved and disbursed? Well, I'm going to talk only about approved at this point. Quickly, what you'll notice from that graph is that 28% of our loans went to Barbados. 25% went to Antigua and Barbuda. And 18% of our loans went to Guyana. So those three countries were the primary beneficiaries of CDB's approvals in 2013. Now, those of you who attend these press conferences on an annual basis will recognize that there's no necessarily consistent pattern in this regard. What is perhaps consistent is that what we do is we put primary emphasis on the OECS countries because that is our charter mandate. We give special and urgent regard to the needs of the smaller countries in our membership. We also emphasize the needs of the poorer countries in CDB's membership. I think you'll see some sort of consistency here in that respect. Some of you might be a little curious about that red tower that is reflected under Guyana. Have no fear. Red in this instance does not necessarily mean danger. What red means is that these are the resources that come from our most concessionary window, that is the Special Development Fund. And Guyana, because of the state of its economy and the overall condition of the social conditions in that country, Guyana continues to be the primary beneficiary of our special development funds. That will not continue forever, and the government of Guyana is very much aware of that. But we are very happy that Guyana makes effective use of the special development funds to which they are entitled. You will notice also under regional, that REG, where you see the other relatively high red tower, that's regional. We have a project, which I'll come to just now, which is of a regional nature, and it is eligible for soft funding under the Special Development Fund window. All right, let's talk about now where the resources went, because that is really what is important at the end of the day. Broadly speaking, 21% of our loans went to the education sector. Why is that so? Why does CDB consider that it should allocate such a large portion of its approvals to the education sector? And when I'm talking education here, ladies and gentlemen, I'm talking about the full spectrum. I'm talking about from basic right through to tertiary. Why is it that the CDB puts so much emphasis on education? The answer is a simple one. We recognize that given the endowments of our countries, and given the way in which the world is evolving today, if our people are not equipped with the educational skills to allow them to be functional, they will never be able to compete and make their place in this world. So that we recognize that we need to invest heavily in our people. And we want to do so through, among other things, the process of education. We are happy that our borrowing member countries recognize the importance of education and are prepared to invest themselves in that sector. So that 21% of our loans have gone to the education sector. The rest of the loans, I will speak to them being largely under the grouping of infrastructure. 79%, therefore, of our loans went into the infrastructure sector. Let me go back now to education and give you a breakout of where the education spend went. Angola received a loan of $3.2 million, and this was for a new Anguilla Community College where we want to strengthen instructional and management capacity and improve quality, relevance, and the relevance of the program offerings. So we're building capacity in that important educational institution in Anguilla, one of our smallest member countries. The regional project that I made reference to is what we call what's it called, Deidre? Open Campus, our Open Campus project, where what we have done is we have expanded and rehabilitated the sites in St. Lucia and in St. Vincent. So we are allocating $6.3 million to the campus in St. Lucia and $6.6 million to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. What are we hoping to achieve there? We want to build technological capacity for service delivery, and we're designing, and the college is going to be designing new demand-driven training programs. One of the things that we recognize, and this is consistent with our primary emphasis and focus on the OECS countries, is that many of these countries, in fact all of them, have no direct access to the educational programs offered by the University of the West Indies. Or they have access to them, but in an insufficiently acceptable manner. So what we are doing is working with the University of the West Indies to build that capacity to improve the quality of the offerings and the quality of the accommodations in, first of all, St. Vincent and the Grenadines and St. Lucia. This is a project that's very close to our heart, and it is also very close to the heart of the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. For Antigua and Barbuda, they're getting $13.4 million, which represents an enhancement of the learning and teaching environment, school management and instructional effectiveness, and educational planning and management at the pre-primary and secondary levels. And on the grant side, ladies and gentlemen, Haiti is receiving a grant of $11 million US, continuing on a program of work to improve the educational system in that member country of the Caribbean Development Bank. The focus here is on primary education and early childhood development for poor children and to enhance equity and governance in the sector. So that's education. Let me quickly move to what is happening on the infrastructure side. As I indicated, 79% of our approvals have gone to this sector. Now, Guyana, the $25 million that Guyana has received is for a project which is to strengthen sea and river defense systems. So even though I have it under the category of infrastructure, I think those of you who were here last year would recognize that this approval is targeted towards climate adaptation. strengthening the resilience of Guyana to climate change. Under that same heading, we also have approved $4.6 million to Barbados for improving drainage infrastructure to reduce flood hazards in Speightstown. That's that important secondary town on the west coast of Barbados. West coast, right, Bajans? Yes. Important project. The dominant expenditure under the infrastructure category is $65 million, which has gone to modernizing the fleet at LIAT 1974 Limited. All of the studies that I have seen in recent times on Caribbean growth and competitiveness suggest that one of the constraints in that regard is the poor logistics infrastructure in this region, whether you're talking about sea transport or air transport. Now, there has been much criticism, and some of it well-deserved, of LIAT 1974 Limited. But ladies and gentlemen, I am one who has to utilize that airline very frequently in my work. And most of my colleagues here at the CDB have to experience the services on LIAT. And in spite of the great need for improvement, I think that we recognize that a Caribbean without a LIAT would be a very, very difficult Caribbean to navigate. So what is our attitude? Our attitude is that we need to work with that institution, as we are doing now, by building its capacity, by improving the quality of its services, so that it can help us to be more efficient in the delivery of air transport. And that's why we have delivered $65 million of our approvals to that entity. How have we done it? We have done it in the risk-prudent manner of working through the shareholder countries, so that we have guarantees from the four beneficiary countries. That's Barbados, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Antigua and Barbuda, and Dominica, the Commonwealth of Dominica. But those resources will not only be used to improve the quality of the fleet, and those of you who have flown on LIAT recently, I think will appreciate how beautiful the ATR 42s and 72s are, a dramatic improvement. So that is to improve the quality of the infrastructure in air transport. We have also provided $11 million to the government, to Belize, to improve, upgrade, and expand sections of its transmission and distribution systems. That is an economy that's growing fairly rapidly, and as they grow, their demand for electricity and the need for greater reliability in the supply of electricity is vitally needed. So we are happy to be able to make that loan. There are two small loans which we have made, small in dollar value, $750,000 each, but very, very important. One to Dominica, the other one to the Bahamas. This is an immediate response loan. This is a facility that we provide to our countries in the aftermath of natural disasters. So, ladies and gentlemen, in a nutshell, that is where the vast majority of our approvals have gone. Let me move now to some of the other highlights of our operations. I made mention earlier of Suriname. If I talk a little bit too much about Suriname, it is because I'm especially excited about the accession of that country to membership in the Caribbean Development Bank. Suriname deserves to be in CDB because Suriname is going to be a very, very important link between the Caribbean and South America. Both the Guyanese and the Surinamese talk about being the frontiers to South America. I don't think there's any competition. We regard them as both very, very key to our linkage to that critical continent. So that Suriname is now on board. Why is Suriname so important apart from the fact that they are on the South American continent and border Brazil and other important countries? Suriname is key to us because it represents new opportunity for development. It represents an occasion for us to share with that country the development experience that we have gained through more than 40 years of operation in the other member countries of this region. We think that Suriname can learn from us. But we're not so arrogant, ladies and gentlemen, to believe that Suriname has nothing to teach the Caribbean Development Bank and the rest of our borrowing member countries. I visited that country a few weeks ago, and it is nothing short of impressive, some of the developments that are taking place there. And we want to help Suriname, and we know that Suriname is going to help us. From a risk perspective, Suriname is vital. Because one of the challenges that we have, being a small development bank in a small geographical region, is concentration risk. Concentration risk is not a good thing for any financial institution. So we have to work very, very hard in order to ensure that we do not become too concentrated. Suriname has a strong economy. They're growing very rapidly, as you'll hear from Dr. Ram, and therefore their needs are great in terms of financing. We intend to be a very strong partner with Suriname. It took us 17 years. Am I correct, Yvette? 17 years to bring Suriname on board. For any kind of relationship, that is a long haul. How many of you would take 17 years to consummate a relationship? I would like to move to the next important point in terms of our highlights. I spoke about us taking on board the criticality of addressing risk management and a number of other reforms. Well, we went after these reforms with a vengeance, with an enthusiasm. We were determined that we were going to take these things seriously and get them done. We haven't completed the reforms. There's still a lot left to be done. But we have made sufficient progress that Moody's Investors Services took the initiative to remove the negative outlook that was on CDB's credit rating and to accord us a stable outlook. That is significant because this is happening at a time when a number of our borrowing member countries were moving in the opposite direction. And as I said in my opening remarks, as goes our countries, so tends to go CDB. So the fact that we are able to move against the tide, I think, is a credit to our staff and the hard work that we have been able to carry out. Another accomplishment that I'd like to make reference to is that the CDB was accredited to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Why is that significant? What it means is that gaining accreditation to the UNFCCC is an essential element in CDB's strategy to position itself as a regional financial intermediary for climate change financing. A few years ago, we brought on board Mr. Selwyn Hart as advisor on climate finance. Selwyn came to us with a very, very good track record. And I must say that this accomplishment is very much attributable to his efforts. And I want to commend him for that. We also launched last year, the Community Disaster Risk Reduction Trust Fund. That is a $23.5 million fund. Major contributors were DFAT-D, that's the Canadian Aid Agency, and DFID of the United Kingdom. There was also a top-up of approximately $2 million, which came by way of the European Union. So those are important developments, because what is it that this Disaster Risk Reduction Trust Fund is all about? What it is it is a community-based disaster risk reduction endeavor. What it is doing is it's bringing disaster risk reduction consciousness and projects to the community level, so that our people at that level can start to build their resilience against climate change. CDB over the years has increasingly become a desired financial intermediary for donors to the Caribbean countries. We are comprised of very, very small countries, and it is uneconomic for donors to be dealing with every single one of our member countries. So it is convenient, it is useful for them to be able to have access to an institution like ours, which is financially sound, financially reliable, and has the capacity amongst its staff to be able to execute projects on behalf of others. The European Union has in recent times become more and more of a partner for us in this regard. And during the course of this year, we were able to conclude agreements, one in relation to natural disaster risk management in CARIFORUM countries. We can talk a little bit more about that during the question and answer period. We were also able to sign an agreement with the EU for a Caribbean Single Market and Economies Standby and a CARIFORUM EU Economic Partnership Agreement Standby Facility. All of this for capacity building. Again, we can talk about that in more detail during the question and answer period. We also facilitated resources to the OECS countries from the IDB, as these countries are themselves not members of the IDB. Let me wrap up. I've gone over my time. 2014 and beyond, what is it that are in our sights going forward? Internally, we want to improve our accountability. We recognize that we have a responsibility not only to our staff, but also to our shareholders and to other stakeholders, that we do the things that we say that we are going to do. So that we have got to be able to not only measure, but we have also got to be able to monitor those things that we say we are going to accomplish. We are putting things in place this year to dramatically transform our ability to carry out this responsibility. The other thing that we recognize is we have to communicate better. We can't just use this annual press conference to be able to send the message of CDB's accomplishments. And if we have learned any lesson, it is that we need to communicate better with our staff. That's where it all begins, communicating with our staff even as we sell our message externally. Speaking of externally, the challenge in the operational work, as I alluded to earlier, is to ensure that we stick to our mandate of meeting the needs of the most deserving in our member countries, while at the same time running a good bank. CDB is both bank and we are also development institution. That is sometimes a very difficult road to travel. But we, without the bank, without the solid financial institution, there is no development function. So that we have got to continuously focus and to develop strategies that do not put us in a position where we undermine the viability of the bank. And that is one of the reasons why we drafted and shared with our shareholders at our annual meeting in St. Lucia last year a strategy for doing exactly that. The elements of it are diversification of the portfolio and focusing on those countries that are relatively underserved in CDB's membership. We also recognize that one way in which we can achieve this effectively is by putting greater emphasis on the private sector. The how and the where of that private sector strategy we can also talk about in the question and answer period. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much, and I apologize for encroaching on Justin's time. But Justin, you have my permission to do your thing.
Dr. Smith, I thank you for giving me a little extra time, a little more leeway, because I do have a lot of ground to cover here. Welcome, members of the media from the region. It's so wonderful to see so many of you here this morning. Welcome to my colleagues of the bank. This morning, I will be going through with you, in turn, a review of what's happened in the global economy, as well as a review of what's happened in terms of regional economies in 2013. Also give you an idea of what our forecasts are for the regional economies and the global economy in 2014. And to end off, I will give you some policy prescriptions for the future, which we think will be necessary to ensure that our economies continue to grow in the near term. So if I do begin here, I'm going to begin by giving you an overview of what's happened in the global economy in 2013. Here we found that global growth continued in 2013. However, there were mixed signs, with limited growth only occurring in the European Union bloc countries. In 2013, however, US policy inertia, along with federal and state government austerity programs, as well as the Federal Reserve's tapering of its bond buying program in the United States, tended to have a tempered effect on overall growth in the US and by consequence on global economies in 2013. Luckily, however, for the global economy, inflation remained relatively subdued, and this is due in part by relatively weak commodity prices. This tended to have quite a positive impact on unemployment rates in the major economies of the world, where we saw, for example, particular improvements in the unemployment rates in both the US and the UK economies. However, I should add that in the EU bloc of countries, the unemployment rate still remains relatively high. But when we look at what's happened between 2012 and 2013, it seems as if the unemployment rate there has plateaued. So that seems to be a good sign for what will be happening in the European Union economies for the near future. However, there was a mixed message associated with employment within the major economies of the world. We found that, for example, in the United States, although unemployment rates improved there was a lower level of labor market participation, which meant that many people who were perhaps seeking work in the US market and were unable to find that work over long periods of time decided to give up on searching for work. So therefore, labor market participation rates in the US tended to decline. And this, in effect, gave us a mixed message with respect to unemployment. Another worrying trend that we should be cognizant of with respect to employment rates is that around the world, youth unemployment rates are still significantly high, both in major markets as well as in our economies in the Caribbean. And it is an area that we would need to pay special attention to. Let me now turn to what's happened in the regional economies in the Caribbean Development Bank's borrowing member countries. What we found here is that in 2013, growth in CDB's borrowing member countries grew at a faster rate at 1.5% in 2013, up from 1.2% in 2012. Most regional economies experienced some growth in 2013. However, there were some exceptions to this where there was a drop in output, namely in Anguilla, Barbados, British Virgin Islands, and in St. Lucia. In Jamaica experienced flat growth in 2013. From this chart here, you can see that goods-based economies tended to outperform service-oriented economies of our region. And so, in fact, most of the growth was led by 3 member countries who are actually considered to be goods-based economies, and those are Guyana, Haiti, Surinam, and to some extent Trinidad and Tobago, although the growth rate in that economy was not as high as in the other 3. There was a 1 to 3% level of growth in half of our service-oriented economies. and that was primarily driven by construction activity, which was spurred by growth in most of our economies due to extra government expenditure on capital projects, some uptick in foreign direct investment in the tourism sector, and by private sector construction initiatives. Let me just go into a bit more detail as what has happened into some of the other sectors. Manufacturing activity rebounded in Trinidad and Tobago in 2013 due to an uptick in cement production in that economy in 2013. This was a rebound from 2012 where they experienced some amount of labor market unrest with respect to their cement production. There was an improvement in manufacturing in Guyana, primarily due to an uptick in the production of milled rice, and this compensated for a decline in sugar production in Guyana. Barbados' food production also showed some improvements, and that tended to help its manufacturing sector here. And also in Dominica, there was an uptick in beverage production, soap, and paint production as well. However, in some of our economies, there was a slight decline in terms of our manufacturing activity. That happened in Jamaica due to weak domestic demand and also a reduction in ethanol production in that island. As well as there was a decline in manufacturing output in both St. Kitts and Nevis, as well as in respect to exports within that economy as it related to electrical components and also in beverages manufacturing. Let me just end here by saying that mining activity improved somewhat in Guyana and Surinam with respect to gold production there, mainly driven by small-scale investments in mining, as well as higher prices for diamonds, which actually led to increased declarations of diamonds in those economies. However, in respect of bauxite production, this tended to have declined in both Guyana and Suriname, but luckily in Jamaica, this alumina production increased in Jamaica due to the resolution of technical issues in that economy. In the other mining economies of the region, we found that oil production was negatively impacted, primarily in Belize, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago, due to reduced yields on oil fields in Belize, reserve depletion in Suriname, as well as maintenance issues in Trinidad and Tobago. Let me focus a bit more now on what's happened to tourism outputs in many of our economies, as it were. A closer look at tourism has shown that the sector continued to expand in most of the tourism-based economies of the region. And for example, there was some growth in non-traditional tourist destinations here. Here I can point out in particular those of Guyana and Suriname experienced growth in tourism arrivals. Stayover arrivals increased most of all in Montserrat, and that was actually a spillover effect of their 50th festival celebrations, which actually occurred towards the end of 2012. So therefore, their stayover arrivals were impacted positively by that in the early parts of 2013. Now, for some of the other islands that are heavily dependent on tourism, and here I can point out in particular Antigua, Bahamas, Barbados, these countries experienced some downturn in their tourism arrivals due primarily to a reduced airlift and the extremely high cost of intra-regional air travel. This is a particularly useful chart for you to look at, because although, for example, in 2013, we found that global economies grew, from this chart we can see that the performance of our economies are lagging those of our peers, in particular those of other small island developing states. Why is that so? We found that in the downturn, which began in 2008 and 2009, that in tourism-based economies, the high income elasticity of demand associated with leisure travel meant that there was a significant impact on tourism arrivals for many of our service-based economies. This has led to and has revealed certain structural deficiencies within our economies that are primarily dependent on tourism, and some of those deficiencies still remain today. This has meant that because we've had lower tourism arrivals and lower tourism receipts, there has been a knock-on effect on the fiscal performance of many of our countries, and I will come to that shortly. What I would like to show here in particular with this slide is that small size is no excuse for underperformance, as it were. The Caribbean economies are still lagging behind other small island developing states, and it means that certain critical structural problems need to be addressed within our economies if we are to have sustainable and lasting growth in the future. Some of these regulatory reforms include, for example, addressing the cost of doing business within our countries, as well as examining the overall cost of energy within our economies. And I will speak to that in a little later on, as well as the need for governments to further tighten their fiscal accounts. I now turn to the fiscal performance within our borrowing member countries, as it were. So the structural problems alluded to in the earlier slide have been translated into deteriorating fiscal accounts in most of our highly indebted borrowing member countries. We found that, for example, in St. Lucia and Barbados, there was the most notable deterioration in debt accumulations. This was followed by those of Antigua and Barbuda, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Dominica to some extent. This high accumulation of debt and worsening fiscal positions also meant that there were credit rating downgrades in some of our borrowing member countries. Now, conversely, in some of the other highly indebted countries of the region, namely Belize, Jamaica, and St. Kitts and Nevis, successful debt restructuring in those economies actually saw improvements in fiscal performance over the course of 2013. Good progress was also made by countries who are involved in IMF-sponsored adjustment programs, and this is in particular related to Jamaica and St. Kitts and Nevis. However, in other less indebted countries within the region, we also saw, to some extent, large increases in debt, although their overall debt to GDP ratios remain relatively low. So, for example, Surinam's public debt, although still low, deteriorated considerably in the year due to higher capital outlays and wage increases, as well as revenue from mining declined within that country. Trinidad and Tobago's debt also increased due to an acceleration in capital expenditure in that country and also wage settlements. Guyana, however, recorded a fiscal surplus, which was very good news, due to debt relief and loan repayments helped their lower debt stock. So let me turn to the global outlook, as it were, for our economies and for the world. In 2014, we're expecting global growth to continue and to, in fact, accelerate, as we expect there will be greater and faster growth in the US, and we are also expecting a return of growth in the EU bloc of countries. We're expecting continued growth in emerging and developing economies, despite what might be considered to be slower growth in China. Although any of us here in the Caribbean would be very happy to have that lower growth, growth in economic activity that China will be experiencing over the next couple of years. However, for the global economy, there are some downside risks that remain, and those are mainly actually related to the tapering of quantitative easing in the United States. That is the reduction of the bond buying program by the Federal Reserve of the United States. This is actually likely to lead to some reverse flows of investment from emerging and developing economies, away from emerging and developing economies towards the US and perhaps also to the UK markets in anticipation of higher interest rates in those economies. That could provide some risk to our economies as we go forward. There's also likely to be some risk associated with the Chinese growth, as their new growth rate might become a new lower normal, as it were. And this is to be expected because we're expecting the Chinese economy to be rebalanced away from an export-driven economy to one that is led by demand consumption at home, as well as there may be a correction in property markets within China, as well as the Chinese authorities may also have to do some corrections with respect to overexposed financial institutions in the Chinese market. How does this all relate to regional growth rates? Well, we're expecting in 2014 that the economies of the region will grow by 2.5%. This is up from 1.5% in 2013. We're expecting this to be driven by the continued recoveries in tourism, as well as in foreign direct investment, which will strengthen and have spin-off benefits in terms of construction and other real sector activity. Tourism is expected to grow due to increased airlift and as well as reduced fuel costs. Commodity exporters in the region, however, may face lower prices, and this may have a dampening impact on their overall growth forecast. However, lower commodity prices is good news for the importers of our region, as this will actually have a dampening impact on inflation and therefore have positive impacts on the balance of payments accounts for our countries. However, although we expect growth to accelerate in 2014, we are still expecting higher levels of unemployment in our countries due to rigidities in our labor markets, as well as the possibility of further public sector and private sector layoffs, as well as hiring freezes, as many of our economies, due to their high debts, may be engaged in structural adjustment programs and fiscal correction to solve many of these issues. So let me just move to part C now, where I will speak about some of the messages that Caribbean Development Bank would like to reiterate to policymakers within the region. We think that it's important for us to strengthen the fiscal position of our economies and to consolidate and sustain the growth that has begun in 2013 and which we expect to continue in 2014 and beyond. What will be required here? We think that regional policymakers will be faced with critical policy challenges. What are these? Well, this diagram shows we think that in respect of the policy challenges facing our policymakers, fiscal adjustment will still be quite necessary because many of our economies are still heavily indebted. Along with this, policymakers will need to ensure that we have environments that facilitate greater business activity and greater private sector participation within our economies. Financial reforms will also be very critical for our economic growth, because without strong financial institutions, our economic growth will not be sustained over the short and medium term. We are still very much developing economies within our region, and we expect in large part that we still have to have significant investment in our infrastructure to allow us to continue to grow and to reach the levels of growth that we have seen in other small island developing states around the world. All of this means that there will be competing needs for finance, particularly from financial institutions the multilateral financial institutions like the Caribbean Development Bank, policymakers would need to prioritize in a real way which of these aspects they will finance, but in reality, all of these nodes need to be addressed at the same time, concurrently. Now, much of this will have to take place around where we know many of our economies are still vulnerable to natural hazards and the impacts of climate change, as we saw what happened to a couple of our economies towards the Christmas break period, where the trough actually inflicted significant disaster impacts on three of our countries. So the key policy imperatives going forward means that policymakers need to ensure that the fiscal consolidation that has started, it's not yet finished, and we need to continue along this path. Why is that important? Well, it remains a priority because if we don't have our fiscal houses in place and actually corrected, this would actually lead to a worsening business environment, as many as investors would not want to invest in an environment where they are unsure of the fiscal situation within many of our economies. We need to ensure that there's higher sustained income growth, and this must happen along with consolidated debt sustainability and an improvement in poverty levels. So along with fiscal consolidation, we must strive to improve the economic environment to foster transformation and growth, and this will present societies within the region with more options for reducing poverty and reducing their overall debt levels. So we must, and this is the Caribbean economies, focus on consolidating our fiscal positions as well as implementing policies that will foster growth for the near term. Now, what do we mean in terms of enhancing the fiscal consolidation for the region? We must look at tax reforms, and this will actually improve the economic efficiency of our countries, as well as improve the tax administration to ensure that the correct level of taxes are being paid by economic actors within our region. But it's not sufficient to only focus on the revenue sides of the fiscal accounts. It's very important for us to have expenditure reforms as well to ensure that expenditure is streamlined. We must also have an improvement in budget systems, divest non-core activities, and here we may also want to consider the privatization of some of our critical assets, or perhaps also the use of public-private partnerships in the management and maintenance of some of these critical assets within our economies. And overall, we need to have improved debt management, as it were, where we may also want to consider having some fiscal rules in place to ensure that in the future we don't actually end up where many of the economies are now with unsustainable high debt levels. Oops. So let me just end here by saying there is a challenging environment ahead, and this will have certain implications for CDB operations. CDB's engagements with the borrowing member countries in 2014 will therefore focus on the following areas: on adjustment, on the improving competitiveness within our economies, and building further resilience of our economies, not only to climate impacts and climate change, but also to ensure that our economies are resilient to the external shocks of the global economy that may actually come our way in the future. It is important as well that we ensure that we have access to financing for investment in all of these areas. Okay, I think that's it. I thank you, and I think it's time for the questions.